G'day. So I've decided to do another one of these off-the-cuff videos, so let's see how I go this time. Yesterday I was reading an article talking about the Diagnostic Statistical Manual and complaining that there was a lack of clear guidelines for a mental illness that the author wanted to call anger disorder. Okay, now first of all, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual is like this great big thick tome that gets updated every few years, and it's supposed to be an index to look up basically all the different psychological mental illnesses, whatever you want to call them, out there, and give you the diagnostic criteria for each one. So if you have X, Y, Z, that's depression. You've got A, B, C, then that's narcissism. And it's just supposed to make mental illness clear and authoritative as to what is going on with people. Now, as with all these things, if you've got human beings making the decision as to what mental illness is, you're going to run into the problem of who watches the watchers. How do we know that the people defining mental illness are not mentally ill themselves and are simply pathologizing otherwise healthy people? I mean, you need some kind of objective method. Now, in physics and chemistry, we'd call that the scientific method. And don't get me wrong, there have been mistakes in those fields, but the scientific method has meant that over time there is agreement about certain things like laws of physics and a way of resolving disputes within the physics and chemistry community. But with psychology, it's not so clear. How do we define what is mental health and what's a pathology? And, I haven't read the latest one, the DSM-5, but I think I practically slept with the DSM-4 for months of my life. And there are some things in there where you think, yeah, okay, I think they're onto something. I think they're describing something that's probably pathological. I mean, almost most likely pathological. And there are other things that they're like, really? You sure though? And what the two of the ones that bother me, well, after reading this article yesterday, I've now got three, because I don't know if they will in the sixth version, if they'll add anger disorder as one there, is that I can definitely see a trend towards pathologizing emotions. Because we've been using, people use this more each day. I hear people say, I've got anxiety, or I've got depression. And they use anxiety and depression in place of more commonplace, old-fashioned terms, like, oh, I'm scared, or I feel sad, or I feel grief. And the use of anxiety and depression is not by accident. This is a form of rhetoric, where if you use a more technical sounding word, you sound more authoritative, more learned. When, for all intents and purposes, anxiety and fear, they can be used interchangeably, and sadness or grief can be used interchangeably with depression. And as soon as you start changing the language that you're using there, you start to see something a bit odd. It's like, well, is sadness a mental illness? Is grief a mental illness? Is anger a mental illness? And also, why isn't joy included in this? Why don't we have joy personality disorder or joyous personality disorder? Which, mind you, wouldn't surprise me if eventually that became included. Maybe leave that for edition 7. But what's happening, in my view, is that we have a conflict of interests in the field of psychology, where there is a lot of people they don't like these three negative emotions in particular: anger, sadness, and fear. These are the three negative emotions that most people kind of like, oh, I don't want that in my life. And you can understand that, but just because you don't want those feelings, does that actually mean they're pathological? Because if you're walking along in the forest and a mountain lion jumps out in front of you, do you want to not feel fear? When you're at work and someone says, look, I've decided that you're not really doing enough work here, even though you've been working really hard, and so I'm going to cut your pay, and it's because somebody else lied and said that passed off your work as their own. Do you really want to not feel angry in that situation? Because anger, I think, would be really helpful and really healthy in that situation, just as fear with a mountain lion would be really helpful for you to feel there. And when someone dies, and this is a more complicated thing, do you want to not feel sadness? Now, you might not realize immediately why you might want to feel sadness, but if you didn't feel sadness and intense grief when someone dies, could you actually appreciate the people in your life? Could you actually love them that much? It's like we love and appreciate people because of sadness. And we can even enjoy and appreciate and be grateful for living because of sadness. And so if we eliminated sadness, we might eliminate gratitude from our lives. Which, yeah, maybe you want to do that, but I know a lot of other people probably don't want to do that. Especially when life still remains life, regardless. And so when I see these things like, oh, depression is a mental illness, I wonder why is that? Now, there's two big conflicts of interest that I see. One's pretty obvious, that to most people see this one, is that pharmaceutical companies will make a fortune selling antidepressants. So if you can make feeling sad a mental illness, you've created a huge market to sell very expensive pharmaceuticals to them. And if you can get doctors and psychologists involved in this, then you can give them a cut of your profits from selling those antidepressants. There have been a lot of scandals about that, and there are certainly some places they're taking legal remedies to try and prevent this from happening, but it still happens. I mean, marketing departments are amazing at finding ways around these conflict of interest laws. But all the same, though, if you just pathologize depression, that is a big business boom if you're in the antidepressant industry. Likewise with anxiety, if you've got an anti-anxiety medication, there's a big conflict of interest there. If you can get anxiety or fear declared as being a mental illness. And it's really important that when we say anxiety, we associate that with, well, you've got a mental illness, you need to take some medication, or you need to spend some time on expensive therapy, which may or may not be true. But if we say fear, we don't think, oh no, you've got a mental illness. We think, you need to develop some character. Very different response. Just by changing the name that we use to describe it. There's different connotations to it. And as a philosophical therapy, the words we use are very important. I'm very aware that the word that we use could very easily be another one. And that word, although it describes the same thing, has different connotations, different framing to it. And so when I read, we need to have an anger disorder, I'm like, oh wow, are they going to have anti-anger drugs? Maybe that's going to be the next big pharmaceutical push. And maybe, because the article that I read wasn't actually very well thought out, it wasn't structured, it just seemed to be like, I feel I have a worry, and not really a good logical argument for why anger should be considered a disorder. Now, another thing I want to point out with these feelings is something that you don't often hear psychologists in the mainstream talk about, and this is the concept of an epiphany. Now, in the therapeutic sense, if you're coming to see a therapist, you can talk for hours, days, weeks to the therapist, and nothing changes in your life, nothing changes in your outlook. And what the point where people actually really get some benefit from therapy is when they have this moment of ha, and that's an epiphany, and they go, I see something about myself, my life, and the world that I'd never noticed before, or that I'd gotten wrong in the past. And suddenly, like a cascade of dominoes is going through their brain, flipping over all the previous assumptions, the false beliefs, the mistakes they'd made, and changing their perspective on their past, their childhood, and all their relationships. And that's actually kind of what's happening in the brain. There's this massive rewiring going on. Post-epiphany, that person has grown. They've changed. And a really important ingredient of having this epiphany is an intense emotional feeling that comes before it. Now, after the epiphany, you usually feel quite elated. You're kind of like, oh, yes, I really feel like I understand things. But how you feel before the epiphany, the emotion that kind of pushes you up the hill to get over that obstacle, is often something like intense grief, intense sadness, intense anger, intense fear. And these feelings are actually kind of pushing you up that hill to reach that epiphany. And each time a person kind of self-medicates, or they try to think about something else, or they take an antidepressant or whatever, some drug to suppress maybe their anxiety, they are delaying the epiphany. They are delaying that amazing eye-opening experience that might change their whole perspective on their life and lead them to finding a solution, a non-pharmaceutical solution, a cheaper solution to their problems. And that is what I call the pathologizing of emotions. Now, the immediate reaction when people is like, what if someone is suicidally depressed? And I'm like, yeah, well, that's really awful. I mean, I totally feel for someone in that situation. You know, in times in my life, I've been in that situation, and I never used pharmaceuticals. I use lots of sugar, though. Not endorsing sugar. No self-medication. Don't take that away from here. The point is, though, I probably needed to feel that miserable, like that suicidally miserable, before I reached that emotional point where I could have an epiphany and re-examine my life and my relationships and see things from a different perspective. It was kind of the nudge. Now, it's really uncomfortable, it's really unpleasant, but it's really unpleasant when a mountain lion jumps out in front of you. And the thing is, like, we've kind of got a really soft, sheltered life in modern world. In prehistoric times, getting terrified and grief-stricken because, you know, a saber-toothed tiger just ripped your best friend's head off on a mammoth hunt gone wrong. Those things were everyday realities. And would you go back there and say, look, yeah, you're grieving too much about Og. Og lived a good life. He was 15. he had a wife and kids. And yeah, it was just his time when the saber-toothed tiger came and bit his head off. I mean, it's no, I mean, those feelings, those grief, they were important for people back then, and they're still important to us now. We still have these struggles, except now we kind of have the option of maybe we can stuff our feelings down a bit. And when there's a market for selling these anodynes, these things that make you feel better in the moment, you are actually kind of cutting yourself off from actual, real, genuine personal growth. Because as hard as it is, and like, if anyone is feeling suicidal, I mean, I really feel for you. You're in a really tough situation. Because if that's what's going through your mind, you are in a very difficult situation by certainly whatever the cause is. I don't even know what the cause is, but it'd be very challenging. But those feelings aren't necessarily the problem. They might actually be part of the solution, the inflammation around the wound, the psychological wound in this case. And it might be beneficial to actually use that emotional energy to examine your life. And, you know, a therapist like myself can help you look at it from a different perspective, because sometimes you do get caught in this rut and you keep ruminating about the same thing over and over again, have the same thoughts over and over again. And so it can be really good talking to someone like a friend or a therapist who can give you a different perspective that might help you break out of that and help you reach that epiphany where you go, wow, it's my problem isn't so much my sadness, it's I don't like my job. Or the problem is not my anger, the problem is I'm getting bullied and I'm standing up for myself, and I'm just holding myself down and beating myself instead of standing up for myself and asserting my boundaries in a healthy way. And so, yeah, when I see these articles about, yes, we've got to pathologize emotions, I get very worried, because I think, well, yeah, there's that one possibility that there's a pharmaceutical, financial conflict of interest there. The other possibility is, what if a lot of psychologists are mentally ill? How do we know? We kind of just take this on trust that the people in psychology and wear these lab coats are somehow an authority, that these people have magically all mentally healthy people, really well balanced, educated, sorted out people. Yeah, if you ever want to look up the history of Kellogg, you might start to question that. In fact, if you look up Freud, you might start to really question the sanity of a lot of these people who are, proclaiming to be knowledgeable about mental health. I really do think everyone needs to understand that there's no such thing as a human authority. Like, truth is the ultimate authority on everything. It's not, no person is an authority. They may imitate authority, and if they speak the truth, they are a conduit for that authority of truth. But people don't have authority. Only the truth has authority. And that's a really difficult concept, that really important one, though, for people to understand. So when people call themselves psychologists and give themselves titles like doctor and professor and so on, and they put letters behind their name, that's all to appear authoritative, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are an authority. It doesn't mean that they are healthy, that they know what they're talking about, or that they've got something useful to share. And a lot of these people have an agenda of their own. And I often use the example of narcissists because that's a very popular one for people to talk about. And if you're a narcissist, other people having emotions is very annoying to you, because a narcissist can't process their own emotions. They've got an empathy deficit, and it's an empathy deficit with themselves as well as other people. They can't sympathize with themselves and their own plight as much as they can't sympathize with other people. And so for the narcissist, they think that all their problems will be solved if other people just did what they tell them to do. And this can be like, well, if you just worked as hard as I did, or worked as hard as I wanted you to, because narcissists often don't actually work that hard. They might pretend to. Or if you just did what I told you to do, your life would be fine. If you just ate this diet that I told you to eat, then all the world's problems would be solved. They kind of have this very simple, childistic view that if you just do what I say, everything will be right. And when narcissists do this to other people, they quickly discover that other people react in fear, sadness, and anger to being bossed around, controlled, manipulated, whatnot. And the narcissist comes back to and goes, well, if they weren't so depressed, or weren't so anxious or irrationally angry about me telling them what to do, the world would be a better place. And so from the narcissist perspective, these are pathologies. And if a narcissist gets a job as a psychologist in a university, which they would desire to do because that would be like, look at me, I'm the best. See, I'm a professor in a university of psychology. Very desirable to have that kind of prestigious position for a narcissist, so they would be motivated to work towards that. And then in that position, they can then push their view that, well, look, if people just weren't so unhappy or scared or angry all the time, and just did what I told them to do, the world would be a lot better place. And they can subvert the literature, they can subvert the education system and their students by teaching them something that is fundamentally ridiculous, that emotions, which we are all born with and are hardwired into our psyche at a very primitive, deep level, are somehow pathological, as if nature or God had made some monumental mess up by giving us these feelings. And the other thing is, if you look at how many people are on medication for having feelings, if you believe that is because of some kind of genetic disorder, then that means you believe a quarter, a third, or maybe close to even half of the population are genetically defective. If you're a mathematician, you will realize how ridiculously absurd that is. And yet that's the fact. If we believe that emotions are bad, then we must also believe at least a quarter of the population to half are genetically defective. I don't know what I can say to people who think that. But other than, well, what's more likely, statistically speaking, that you have a tiny proportion of narcissists in a position of authority who have an issue with the vast majority of people who are not actually sick and will try to put their sickness, define their sickness as mental health, and in turn define other people's health as indeed sickness. Anyway, I hope you found that really insightful. Until next time, Spera ad Astra.